We are at Yeshiva University's museum, standing outside of one of the most fascinating exhibits. What's the name of the exhibit?
The Golden Path, Maimonides Across 8 Centuries.
I tried to remember it, but I didn't. The Golden Path, Maimonides Across 8 Centuries at the Yeshiva University Museum. A fascinating overview of the life, legacy, and impact of the Rambam, otherwise known, aka Maimonides. And we're standing here with the curator. What's your title on this?
I'm a guest curator.
The guest curator, our friend, Dr. David Sclar. Thank you so much, number one, for taking the time to do this. This is an incredible exhibit. Tell me, how did this come about? Did you have all this stuff? This was hanging out in your basement?
If only. So it goes back about 15 years. When I moved to New York, I was working for a number of years in the special collections of the Jewish Theological Seminary. A library there. This is the greatest Judaica collection that's ever been assembled. I know you did a video there.
Yes.
While I was there, I was cataloging material, working with scholars, and also co-curated exhibitions with Sharon Lieberman-Mintz, who you know. At some point, Sharon works a lot with collectors, and at some point she told me that there was a collector in Chicago by the name of Bob Hartman, who is singularly focused on Maimonides manuscripts and rare books, and he wanted somebody to write about his material. And she knew that I could do that because we'd worked on exhibitions before. And I started doing one by one, sort of piecemeal. And over a number of years, I became the curator of his collection. The core of the exhibition is his collection. What happened was that over about a 10-year period, I'd written nearly 200 pages. And I said to him, is he ready to do an exhibition and we could publish the catalog? And he wasn't ready, but right the summer before the pandemic, he reached out and said he thought he was ready. And we went back to Sharon and thought about the YU Museum, and there were various discussions, and ultimately it was decided that it could be here.
And YU was like the perfect home for something like this.
Absolutely. And then about 2 years ago, a bit more, Gabe Goldstein came on, who previously had been a curator here at the YU Museum and then was consultant to various institutions, and he came on as a project director. And he said to me that we could make this big, which meant the Hartman family collection is the single most impressive collection at all of Maimonides manuscripts and early printing or rare printing. But he said, what if we were to go for manuscripts that are just fantastic, illuminated manuscripts, autographs of Maimonides, those sort of things. And we did. And we had lots of institutions that responded wonderfully. So we have material from the Bodleian Libraries in Oxford, we have material from from the JTS Library, from the Royal Danish Library in Copenhagen, from HUC, Hebrew Union College. I'm missing National Library of Israel.
And it's all here at the Yeshiva University Museum. Can we go check it out?
Absolutely.
Let's go check it out. Our series, Show and Tell, will take you inside some of the great libraries, both public and private, to explore books and treasures from Jewish history. My question is, you had this core collection from Hartman. How did you know who had what from all the other Maimonides, Rambam related stuff out there?
When you're in the profession, you know what is where, you know who, you have contacts anyway, you know what to do. The piece that we start with actually is partly owned by Yeshiva University Museum. The other partner is the Walters Museum in Baltimore, this wonderful art museum in Baltimore.
So why
start
here?
The piece is a no-brainer, and I'll tell you why in a moment. Why we wanted this to open the exhibition is because it is literally a door. It's a Torah arc door. It opens. It has at the top a line that says
Pischuli Sharei Tzedek?
Yes, Pischuli Sharei Tzedek. So here we are entering into the gates of righteousness. The idea of openness is that we're going through on this path, and this is an elevated path. We're not talking about physically like a path that we're walking, although there's that element as well, because the entire exhibition covers, it's Maimonides Across 8 Centuries. It's geographically expansive and temporally, but we're also speaking about something higher, intellectually, spiritually. So this, to me, was a no-brainer to start the exhibition.
Because where is this from?
Okay, so the piece itself is about 1,000 years old, if not older. It is a Torah ark door from the Ben Ezra synagogue in Fustat. Fustat is in Egypt. It is now what is considered to be Old Cairo. Cairo was a city that was in fact founded after Fustat. And the reason it's particularly relevant is because Maimonides lived the last 3.5 decades in Fustat. This is an ark door, a Torah ark door, that he would have known of, would have seen.
It could have been inside of this synagogue.
Would have been inside the synagogue, or whatever the earliest version of the synagogue was, and would have known this and seen this. The reason it's particularly important is because beyond its ancient status, and just the fact that it's beautifully done and that we still have this and it's preserved, is that the Ben Ezra synagogue is more famous for being the home of what's famously known as the Cairo Geniza. Geniza being a repository of items, usually with God's name on it, that would not ordinarily be destroyed out of
in the garbage.
Exactly,
They're
out of
preserved
respect, but instead would be buried, sometimes
in a
referred to
respectful
as
way.
Exactly, sometimes would be referred to as shemot or shemus, and would go and be buried in a cemetery. There was an Islamic practice to not in fact bury, but sometimes just preserve in an attic or in various buildings. And in this particular case, the Jewish community for centuries did just that. They preserved, or they kept these things in an attic and ultimately in walls of the synagogue.
And that famous Cairo Geniza was from this synagogue.
Yes, and this is one and the same.
Wow.
Now,
and why is the Cairo Geniza connected to the Rambam specifically, aside from the fact that it was his shul?
Because we have documents from Maimonides in his own handwriting with his signature that were discovered in the Cairo Geniza.
Do we have those documents here?
We do.
Let's check some out. So from the Cairo Geniza, we actually found actual manuscripts in the hand of the Rambam that just humanizes him in a way that, like, we know a great deal about the Rambam.
Yes. Now, we would have known a great deal anyway, but there's something called a primary source, which is different than a secondary source. Primary source being something from that time and place that really puts us as the reader or the viewer in that time. We're able to, there's less of a division, over time. And we have more from and to and about Maimonides as a person based on the Cairo Geniza and other sources as well than really any other Jew in the medieval period.
So can you show me which over here is actually from the Cairo Geniza?
So all three of these documents on the wall are from the Cairo Geniza. They were all discovered in the Cairo Geniza.
And how do we know they're the hands of the Rambam?
Okay, so the one on the top, the majority of what is written there, when you look closely, and all three of these, by the way, are from the JTS library. When you look closely, it is not in fact in his handwriting. It is a circular that is essentially a letter that would have been mass-produced with the intention of raising funds to redeem captives, Jewish captives who now need some sort of ransom that is paid to redeem them. What we do have at the very bottom, though, is his signature. It says Moshe Bar Maimun Zal, Zal meaning Zichrono Libracha, referring to his father Maimun. And
his signature is basically giving it that authority to raise money, like
and
you have nowadays, where rabbis will sign on to something to get people to donate to something.
Exactly, and he also he's a communal leader. I mean, we know Maimonides as a rabbinic scholar, a philosopher, a physician, everything that goes around with those ideas and those, but he was also a communal leader. And here he represents his devotion to the community, and he's writing. First of all, he's not going to write each of these himself. He has somebody who's working for him, because he's not going to write however many needed to be written. He'll just sign them. But the other thing is that he describes this sort of, well, you don't really need to hear this from me, because of course you're all devoted the same way that I am. So this is one way that we now have his signature, and you can start, for scholars who work in what's called paleography, which is essentially the science of writing, the actual physical writing, you can start to determine what is similar to it. So we have additional fragments here, this being a fragment of the Mishnah Torah. He wrote the Mishnah Torah between 1170 and 1180, and it is this massive revolutionary legal code. And what's fantastic about it, and this especially for educators, is that it's clear that he is editing himself, meaning he's going over it. continuously, right. There are notes on the side. We have other fragments where he's crossed something out and he's added something, he's changed it. His ideas are constantly working because thinking is a process, writing is a process. So rather than imagining, okay, there's the Rambam, and it's just...
You see him unfolding.
Exactly. This was a human being who lived a life, a complicated life, a very deep life. We know that he had a brother who he was very close to, who passed away in 1177, and Maimonides was completely depressed for a year. And he faced depression.
In a shipwreck, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there are other letters, including we have an example on the wall, an excerpt from the wall, where he's referring to his commitment to the community and what his life is like and how busy he is.
How taxing it is, his daily schedule.
This second piece is also hugely significant. This is a Mishnah Torah, not written itself by Maimonides, who was a scribe. However, at the very bottom, you'll see on the left page, it says, Hugam Sifri Ani Moshe Berabi Maimun Zal. It's the same signature, you can compare it to that one. And here he has signed this. What this ultimately represents is that Huga means that he's proofread this according to his own copy. And this represents what's in Islamic term is ijaza, and which essentially refers to an authorization and also a copyright.
And the Rambam, in my living room, I have a set of the Mishnah Torah. Is it based off of this edition?
Not necessarily specifically this, but depends. There are multiple editions. Sometimes they've been censored over the time that it's been lost.
Gotcha.
There are newer editions in recent decades.
The Frankel Rambam has taken this into account.
Yes, and Yosef Kapach was famously a huge Maimonides scholar and a rabbi who devoted much of his time to preserving Yemenite culture and Maimonides and Saadia Gaon as well. And they are individuals and there are other scholars today who devote themselves to manuscripts and to essentially getting back to the core of what it's supposed to be.
You chose a quote over here that's not, it's not from Mishnah Torah or one of the classics. It's from another. Right. Why did you choose this?
So this is from a famous letter that he wrote at the end of his life, towards the end of his life. He died in 1204. This is from 1199. He had written the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide of the Perplexed. It is this extremely complicated but profound philosophical text that attempts to essentially balance reason and philosophy, Aristotelian philosophy, with faith in the Torah and dedication to Torah. He had received a letter from Shmuel ibn Tibbon in Provence that he was translating the Moreh Nevuchim, and he was translating the guide, and he has questions for Maimonides, and he wants to come to Egypt, to Fustat, to study with him, to ask him
like a student visiting his Rebbe.
Right. Maimonides answers some of these questions, but then says, you can't possibly come. One reason he gives is that it's a dangerous journey. And as I mentioned before, his brother had passed away on a sea voyage, and he was concerned that this could happen also to Shmuel ibn Tibbon. Exactly. But what really, at the end of the letter that is so important, is that he describes his day. And this is where we start to feel who Maimonides was as a person.
In his own lifetime.
Exactly. He has no time. He is serving as one of the physicians at the Sultan's court. He goes, he has to be there until essentially they say that it's not necessary for him to stay. He goes back, he sort of apologizes to all the people waiting for him in his home. I have to go eat, then I'll be ready to meet with you. He eats quickly, then they start coming in one by one. Who knows what all the questions potentially are. Surely he's getting tons of letters, he has to respond to them. By the end of this letter, he's describing how every single day he's just laying down on his back, and he's prescribing, and he's answering just from his sheer exhaustion.
While he's lying down.
Exactly. So now, for the educators out there, it's really significant that he told a student who is completely dedicated to what he is doing.
Wants to come learn, wants to come study.
That you cannot come, because this is what I have to do. And there's a lot to that in terms of who he was as a person, I think.
Communal responsibility
and what he was dedicated to. And there's a lot of debate in terms of who was Maimonides, as a philosopher or as a physician or as a legalist, as a halachic, a jurist. But of course, we are singular individuals. There's uniqueness, and we are complicated, and there doesn't necessarily have to be a division of personality.
He was balancing all of this.
Right. Apparently out of sheer exhaustion. Almost sheer exhaustion.
Indeed.
Yeah.
This is just the basic...
this is a map that shows his journey here, and then all of the cities and the centuries that are referred to, these are objects in the exhibition, meaning we've got material from Rome, 15th and 19th century, Lviv, which is Lemberg, so this is 19th century, a 19th century object. It sort of gives a map of what the exhibition is.
You divided this whole exhibit up into like 3 parts.
Yes.
And the room that we were just in was called Luminaries.
Luminary.
Luminary.
As in Maimonides in his own time.
Maimonides himself. Now we're stepping into this new, this is almost like the biggest room. Looks like it has the most manuscripts, etc., etc. So what room is this?
This is called Radiance.
And what are you trying to show in this room?
So this is the expansion of his legacy. In the other room, which was Luminary, we had Maimonides himself and his immediate impact in those following 2 centuries. Mm-hmm. Here, there's a radiance. It's now outside of Maimonides as a person, which gets back to sort of where we are today and how we imagine
and
the
past. And the rays, the impact.
But in fact, the influence and simply the expansion of his writings and his legacy itself.
So show me here, where do we see that? I mean, I see some gorgeous manuscripts.
So
where would you want to start?
We have 2 main parts to this.
Okay.
One is, this is really covering the 15th and 16th until through the 18th centuries, what's called the early modern period, and that's what academics refer to it as. The most important element of that is the invention of printing with movable type. That means now the printing press. Johannes Gutenberg invents the printing press with movable type, that's not block printing. And you now have a text that can be reproduced in hundreds of copies in a single shot. Now, it's not something that's easy, and it's something that is expensive, but it changes the spread of access to knowledge. In the particular case that we're dealing with Maimonides, access to his text and what that ultimately means. So we have one section, it sort of goes around like this, dealing with printing specifically, and various stories related to the development of technology, the influence and relationship between Jews and Christians, various events, major events in Jewish history, and also different ways that Maimonides is seen. Now, previously we were seeing how he was a physician and a philosopher, and
he was as an individual. As
exactly,
a person.
But he included all of these, encompassed all of these, a plethora of elements essentially. But over the centuries, there starts to be a diversification, a compartmentalization of these ideas. So then you'll have books that will refer to Maimonides as a philosopher or as a Kabbalist, but one in opposition to this, or one as just as a physician. So here it's Maimonides removed from the actual person, and of course now he's quote unquote the Rambam, meaning like this idea.
It almost becomes like the Rorschach test. So different people are seeing different things now.
Yes, and in essence you become, he is what you want him to be. So that's one section. It covers most of this because printing is so important. Really, the comparison that I could make potentially for some of your viewers would be for those of us who remember what it was like before there was an internet. Mm-hmm. That was hugely influential and changed our world.
Yes.
The printing press did the same. However, it's not the only thing that matters during these centuries, and that's what these cases are, and including the special ones that are right in the middle, which is the continued importance of manuscripts. So that means the printing press is, what it can do, besides spreading knowledge, is that it fixes texts, meaning it sets texts, because now you have 300 or 500 or 1,000 copies of something. But what can happen is that errors can creep in. Once there's one error, and now there are 1,000 of them, and then now it spreads. So what can happen, or what is important with manuscripts, is that there's first of all a preservation of tradition, and there's also the potential to correct what might have
crept in and mistakes that have. So over here we're moving through the centuries now. These editions of the Rambam look like they're coming from the 16th century.
They are.
And what makes these unique?
So there's a particular story being told right here. This is Jewish-Christian relations, one aspect of it. in mid-16th century Italy that had massive ramifications over the next several centuries. Earlier in the exhibition, we have this story, this printing story, the importance of print and the development of technology. By the mid-16th century, you have huge volumes of the Mishnah Torah, his revolutionary legal code, yes, that have lots of commentaries.
They're starting to fill up the page around it,
they're
surround it.
expanding.
Yes.
It's not just the same thing happens with the Talmud. The technology develops that you can keep it adding, you can use different fonts, and in these particular cases, these are two editions, rival editions, printed in Venice between 1550 and 1551 of the Mishnah Torah. There was a rabbi in Padua. Padua is now a 25-minute train ride from Venice, named Meir Katzenellenbogen. He had written a commentary on the Mishnah Torah. He went to one press in Venice. The press was owned, Jews were not the owners of the presses. This press was owned by Marco Giustiniani, and he wanted to reproduce his commentary with the Giustiniani Mishnah Torah. They had a falling out. He pulled his commentary, that is Rabbi Meir Katzenellenbogen.
Pulls his commentary.
Exactly, went to a rival printer, Bragadini, and said, okay, I'll print this with you. Bragadini says, yes, great, and you now have two rival editions. The reason is because Giustiniani produced an unauthorized version of the Mishnah Torah with the Katzenellenbogen commentary.
With the commentary.
Yes.
This is like
So
early copyright law.
It is exactly an issue of copyright. Each of the lawyers, Katzenellenbogen himself is upset about it. He actually writes to a very young Moshe Isserlis, the Ramah, saying one has to be banned, the one that's unauthorized. But the presses themselves are also, they have a problem. Because you have to now sell your copies and which
your
one.
stock.
Right, exactly. So they have lawyers, this is the early 1550s, they go to papal authorities. The church essentially uses this as an opportunity to ban Jewish, specifically rabbinic texts. There are orders, this goes back and forth, and it's over a number of years.
Because the church is just like, enough.
There's a concern over heresy and the concern of what the rabbinic texts are saying.
And that all emerges from this copyright case.
This is precipitating it. It's not going to come out of nowhere. It does, but it represents what takes place, and it ultimately is one of the factors that leads to, famously, these massive conflagrations, these burnings of the Talmud and other rabbinic texts in Venice in 1553 and in Rome in 1554. We have a document on the wall from Venice ordering that Jews provide all rabbinic texts. It's not all Hebrew. It's not a biblical text, a specifically rabbinic text, because the Bible, what's quote unquote
still sacred
exactly
in the Christian world.
But it states that you have to submit these things to be checked and ultimately to be destroyed.
Wow.
The fragment on the right happens to be something that survived such a destruction because it was a commentary on the Mishnah Torah, written, not printed. This is from the 15th century, so before printing, mostly before printing. A commentary, the Maggid Mishnah, that was written on parchment. Parchment being a very stiff, first of all, it's very expensive.
And durable.
And church authorities, as thousands and thousands of rabbinic texts are coming in, anything that's paper can be destroyed, but if there's something that's parchment, we can use this to stiffen bindings for our own books.
Oh.
So there is something...
The church didn't even destroy it.
Exactly. So that now the text itself essentially becomes eradicated. It's not going to be used. We don't, we as the church don't have to worry about Jews now studying this, but instead it can be used, and in fact there are thousands of these examples all over European libraries. We used the expression Cairo Geniza before, and we described exactly what a Geniza is. There are scholars in Europe who now refer to the European Geniza, which in essence means in these European libraries,
texts that were confiscated,
that were now used and are on shelves today, used as part of bindings of Latin texts or other vernacular languages.
Was this used for binding
originally? It was. Now it happens to be that the conservators did such a fantastic job, it's hard to see it. But if we were to open this up and I were to show you where it was filled in, then you'd see folds.
Part of a different book and used to kind of...
It originally was this commentary.
Wow.
It was studied as a commentary on the Mishnah Torah, and then it was confiscated, used as a binding, and now is an object that the Hartman family had devoted to the National Library of Israel, and then they sent it back for the exhibition.
Incredible. Okay, so before we get to there, Maybe take me. This looks like the piece de la resistance.
It is. Okay, so these are two of the most important manuscripts in the world related to Maimonides. The one on the right is his commentary on the Mishnah. The Mishnah, the great rabbinic text upon which the Gemara, the Talmud, is based.
It's opened up to a very naughty page.
So we'll get to that in a moment. This commentary on the Mishnah, Maimonides wrote. He was the first to really write a comprehensive commentary on the Mishnah. Scholars see this, the entire thing, some see it as completely his autograph, as in he wrote every word of this.
Word.
There are other scholars who see it as potentially that it was written by a scribe, but that notes in the margins are his. And there's a reason for that, because you can just see that there's a distinction between the actual handwriting. It's also very important because of the diagram. The diagram of the menorah.
You picked this page deliberately, didn't you?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, when you go to a museum, nothing is just random. So you'll see that the menorah includes these branches, these arms that are straight. It's likely a schematic, meaning that he didn't intend to say that this, the menorah actually was straight. And really in antiquity, generally the material or the representations of the menorah that we have from late antiquity are famously the curved branches. But it's most famous today, where we are today now, over the last several decades, because the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, insisted that this is how the Maimonides saw the menorah, that it would have been straight-armed. And in fact, all over the world, you'll see
ubiquitous Chabad
exactly.
menorah is based on this text. And where does this come from?
Both of these manuscripts are housed in the Bodleian Libraries in Oxford.
And where did they get them from? Was this also in the Geniza?
No, these were never lost, as the material in the Geniza would have been. These were preserved by his family initially, and then made their way. Eventually, in the 17th century, they were purchased. There's sort of different stories. So there are a handful of important pieces here. Just to give an example, all three of these manuscripts are from Yemen. Now, there was never Hebrew printing in Yemen. Okay. Jews were early printers, meaning there were Jews sort of jumped on the new technology. The first printing in Portugal and in North Africa and the Ottoman Empire, it was all Hebrew printing. Okay. But Hebrew printing never made its way to Yemen. It does not mean that the Yemenite Jewish community was so far afield and separate from the Jewish world. Yemen was crucial to trade between India and the Mediterranean. And Jews in Yemen are connected to Jews in the Mediterranean. And we have proof of that here. But there are two pieces in particular that are very interesting. One related to something we saw in the other room, and another that will relate to the printing aspect. The first is that you'll see that we have a graphic here of this menorah that we discussed. This is from that manuscript that's at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. Underneath it is a manuscript. This is a Hartman family piece that also has a menorah with the straight arms. Now, this manuscript is not based on this per se. It does not mean that the scribe here saw this. But what it does represent, and what Rabbi Yosef Kapach had indicated in his works, was that there are at least 6 copies of these Yemenite manuscripts that have the straight arm, which means that there was a tradition for this. Mm-hmm. Now,
it was just at random, or
exactly. Now, scholars can state, oh, well, this is a schematic, meaning it's just meant to indicate what it's supposed to not physically look like, but what the pieces sort of represent. Mm-hmm. But as far as Yemenite scribes and the intention to preserve Maimonides and his writings, what it really represents is this. We know that there is a dedication to the way the Rambam presented this. Mm-hmm. So what this represents here is that Yemenite Jews are preserving Maimonides. They have a tradition for the straight-armed. They're not interested necessarily in aesthetic value, although you do see Yemenite manuscripts that have that. But instead, a dedication to the actual sort of preservation of Maimonides. It's interesting because when you compare it to this manuscript, now this is from Germany, meaning Ashkenaz.
Non-Yemenite.
Exactly, in 14th century, and there's this beautiful depiction of the menorah. And here what we have,
shaking my head,
it's a purely aesthetic, it's produced for aesthetic value.
And this menorah is curved,
that it
not
is.
like the
Right.
original one and the Yemenite one.
Right. One of the reasons that this is particularly important, though, when we have these as juxtaposed to each other, is because we're not here to judge whether one or the other was correct, or whether
Which was the Rambam's preferred conception of the menorah.
Exactly. The point of the exhibition is to simply understand the story. Here we have this individual, his massive impact, his spreading influence. Who are the people involved? How is this received? How are they representing this? What does it mean to them, and to both to the scribes or the artists, and to the communities in which they live?
I just have to ask you in one word: are you team curved menorah or straight menorah?
Probably curved, but that was more than one word. So, in some ways, this exhibition it's not a Maimonides exhibition. It's not even a book exhibition. It is 800 years of Jewish history. We're using objects, we're using Maimonides as the conduits through which to tell stories. There is a piece here that's very rare. There are probably only 7 or 8 of these in the world, that was printed in Venice in 1665. The book itself is small. It's pretty unassuming. It says Mada Was Maimonides. These are the first 3 books of Maimonides Menorah. Compared to the 2 volumes that we were looking at before, this is very small.
Yeah.
It means it has no commentary.
Doesn't look so impressive.
It's just the text of Maimonides. This is part of what was taking place in the 17th century, of a sort of back to the basics.
Let's get back to the
Exactly.
essentials.
Let's move away from commentary so that we can just study what does the original say, what does Maimonides say, and there's actually something similar that happens with the Talmud, where you're just studying the Gemara itself and the commentary. So these are small format editions.
Sure.
It's for people who are not scholars necessarily, and they're going to
Let's just
learn
get back to the
Exactly.
basics. So why is this significant?
It's significant not because of Maimonides and not even because of the thing that I just told you. It's significant because of what's on top of the title page. What does it look like to you?
I see a man riding a lion.
He is riding a lion, and in fact we have the graphic here, which is much larger. And if you look at it, you see that the lion is looking back to this man, and his mouth is open, his teeth are very sharp and bared, and the man is putting his hand into the lion's mouth.
Like Siegfried and Roy, like they're doing a...
Yes, but things worked out not so well for them. Here, this man, it would seem to be just fine. The lion looks like it's submissive. What this represents is the first printed reference to Sabbatai Zevi.
Wow.
The famous Messiah that led to, this was the greatest Jewish messianic movement in history, that between 1665 and 1666, much of the Jewish world was sure that now the Messiah had arrived. People were selling property, ready to make their way to Jerusalem. There were children who were prophesying in the streets. It eventually became something that was regarded as heresy once Sabbatai Zevi converted to Islam under duress, although it was justified mystically, Kabbalistically as to what he was doing. And there was something essentially that scholars refer to as Sabbatianism. It was very important and very complicated and sort of
caused a rupture in rabbinic authority and Jewish history.
Over the next
this
2
is
centuries. The first printed reference to
Sabbatai Zevi.
The reason we know that it's Sabbatai Zevi.
Yeah, how do you know for sure? I mean,
Okay.
I see where you're coming from, because you see the lion, he looks, I guess not everybody rides a lion. You got to have some messianic ambitions. But how do you know for sure?
There was a letter that Nathan of Gaza, who was a young man, a young Kabbalist, had written. He actually describes that Sabbatai Zevi is the Messiah, and he's riding a fire-breathing lion. It is possible that this is, in fact, an earlier version of what that letter was. And the work that I did in order to understand its importance, I'm not the first person to have this, I didn't discover this and claim this as Sabbatai Zevi. But what is fascinating is when you can start comparing one printed book to something that might have been printed just, adjacent to it. And this is where we get to the idea of understanding who a particular person was and trying to figure out what their activities were and what they were interested in, the same way that we were thinking about the Rambam before. The printer of this volume was called Domenico Vedelago. This was finished in early June 1665. So this is before we know that Nathan, before the scholars have, until recently, until what we're talking about now, before Nathan has even spread this information. However, 2 weeks later, Vitilago finished a different book, and there he again he explicitly refers to the Messiah coming, and there's a reference to a Sabbatai.
Wow.
I could show you, it's fascinating. And then there's another book 3 months later that has another reference to the Messiah.
Was this printer Jewish?
He was.
Yes.
What probably happened, because it's the title page is so, it's sort of cobbled together, is that he was finishing this book, back to the story about we've got this new educational intention. Back to the story of, here we've got this new educational approach, just printing Maimonides, the first 3 books of the Mishneh Torah. They're about to finish. He hears about this Messiah arriving. He gets very excited. It's spontaneous messianic response. He rapidly commissions an engraving of this man riding a lion. If you look at engravings from the 17th century and from the 16th century, there are some that are amazingly done. This I could not do, but it's not one of those.
Finest
it's okay.
From the.
So in other words, he somehow gets somebody to do this.
And he adds it on,
they move the basic, if you look at it, you never see the title page. It looks weird. They sort of stamp it at the top. And you see it goes
onto the page. It looks,
yes.
So this happened post facto. He's hearing the news.
Yes, so basically they had set the title page, but before they printed it, they just sort of moved that block down, and then they ran it through the press a second time.
You can literally
see
it. You can see it in the page.
Exactly.
Wow, the first printed reference to Sabbatai. Unreal. That's really cool. We just stepped we began as a luminary.
Yes.
Radiance. What room are we in now?
So this is called Prism.
Prism.
Yes, and it's a multiplicity of Maimonides, a multiplicity of images. When you walk in, you can see there's just this openness and also a refraction. There's sort of refracted light. This happens in the modern period. Referred to previously that, Maimonides was one person. Mm-hmm. Yes, he was a physician and philosopher and a legalist, but these are not divisions within him. There's to some extent, that begins in what we showed in the following centuries, and certainly by the modern period and where we live today and how we live today.
Now it becomes a real prism.
There's a great division and compartmentalization that exists. So this is part of that story, including where we are today and who we are today. The cases here, the objects here, run from the 18th century, picking up where we were, but straight until today, to the modern day. Two of the most significant pieces, I think, here are this very unassuming page right here in the middle. This is the writing.
Looks like a luach, like a calendar.
That's exactly what it is.
You see March, April. You can even make out the dates. Who wrote this? Why is it significant?
This was written by Isaac Newton.
The Isaac Newton.
The Isaac Newton. And Isaac Newton used Maimonides. He was concerned with calendar reform. Mm-hmm. So the modern Western calendar that we have, the Gregorian calendar, was adopted in England in the 1750s. This was written in London around 1699. He was working on calendar reform at the time, and he turned to Maimonides, the laws of the new moon, where Maimonides has this concept of how you can predict the new moon, and Newton was working with that.
Fascinating. And is it unusual that Isaac Newton would turn to the Rambam? I mean, he was a chair in Cambridge. I mean, he was a serious person. So, why turn to the Rambam to get calendar advice?
It's a good question. Maimonides was highly regarded, not just in the Jewish world, but in fact was studied, including in England, in the 17th and the 18th centuries. It's not unheard of that Newton would have turned to Maimonides.
And Newton in particular had a real fascination with Jewish texts.
Yes, and what's interesting, so this you can say, okay, we understand Newton as a scientist, as a mathematician. But there's another element that lots of people are not aware of, although scholars have worked on this significantly in recent decades, which was that he had an entire religious and spiritual and eschatological side to him.
Sure.
And so there's another place
Wasn't
that
a small side.
Correct, and he didn't just use Maimonides with respect to science or to mathematics, but in fact turned to Maimonides when he was to Maimonides' description of the biblical temple.
Yes.
And as far as Newton was concerned, Solomon's temple, the dimensions of it represented the cosmos, and therefore when he wrote a treatise on the temple, he turned to Maimonides, which lots of people would, in order to try and understand what did the temple look like.
Absolutely fascinating. It's my Parshas Truma year.
Oh,
Jewish history in the Parsha. I did it. It's Parshas Truma.
Yeah. Oh, amazing. Another great piece. This is actually from the American Jewish Historical Society, which is also here at the Center for Jewish History, one of the partner institutions with the YU Museum here. It is a prayer composed in New York following the Revolution, the American Revolution, by a cantor about whom we know very little, almost nothing.
In America.
In America, in New York, a cantor of Sheareit Israel, the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue. And here, it's a reference, there are references to the 13 states, and we've got Governor Clinton and General Washington mentioned. And the reason it's significant here is because this cantor also referred to Maimonides' 13 principles of faith. In other words, the 13 and the 13.
And the 13 colonies, so to speak, the 13 states, have this parallel to the 13 principles, have this mystical connection almost.
And the characteristics, God's midot, and that as well.
So. That is fascinating. And you can literally see it. I see right over here, George Washington, a very curious spelling of the name George.
Yeah, that's great.
But I'll let them off with that. Just don't use that for your ksubas. That's absolutely fascinating. Kashem shenasata shalos esro medinos America ha'elu l'cheres olam kain totzienu shenis me'atos l'cheres. Just like you gave us these 13 shalosh esro, like you're using the real language of the 13 colonies of America that you gave them for freedom to the world. So too you should take us a second time me'atos l'cheres, the Jewish people, so to speak.
And as Americans.
This is a really fascinating text. He writes over here, Kashem shenasata koach l'shimshon ben Manoach, just like you gave strength for Shimshon, like the story in Nevi'im, so too they're also asking, you should also give Techazek Magin Yeshua la'adonenu Rosh V'sar Hatzava, George Washington. George Washington should also be strengthened and have that strength like Shimshon, who fought. What a fascinating prayer.
The pieces here all relate to what's happening in the modern period. So you've got an appreciation of medieval Sfarad, an association of Maimonides and Isaac Abarbanel. You have in Yemen a response to using Maimonides as a response to the rise of Kabbalah. This manuscript was copied in the 19th century it was a copy from a manuscript that's currently in the Bodleian Library. It was part of the academic study that's developing. You have famous sources, so maybe you want to say something else specifically about this? Yes.
This is the first edition of Reb Chaim Halevi, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik on the Rambam. That's become a classic for really the brisker analysis of the Rambam. It was published, I believe, after his lifetime by his children. There's a brisker tradition long held that they like to publish after the author already passes. Why this is significant to me is because I also inherited one of these from my grandfather. It was published in 1936. My grandfather was born in 1915, and he got a copy when he went to learn in Yeshiva, he learned in Torah V'das, and he was the first graduating class of Yeshiva's Chafetz Chaim with under Rav David Leibowitz, who was a great nephew of the Chafetz Chaim. But the one thing that I got from my grandfather's library, I don't have it under a glass case, and it's not quite in as good condition, but I also have this first edition, and it's...
Your grandfather learned from it.
Yeah, I learned from it. Okay, I like this one.
No, this one, right, is right. So, we mentioned Chabad before, so Lubavitcher Rebbe instituted beginning in 1984 this regular study of the Mishnah Torah, this daily study, and then there's a cycle of it. And this is a New York Times article from 1986 referring to the celebration when they finished it. The Siyum.
On the 750th anniversary of the passing of the Rambam, his yahrzeit, I believe the New York Times went to Rabbi Soloveitchik the grandson of Reb Chaim Halevi that we see over here, to ask him for a quote. Maimonides has passed. Do you have a quote for the newspaper? Rabbi Soloveitchik responded, "This is the first I'm hearing that the Rambam is dead."
Oh yes, famously. So part of the significance of Maimonides' reception in the modern period is that there's now a reception of the image, the physical image, a depiction of Maimonides as a person that we can look at. We have 3 examples here. We have other examples against this wall, which become more and more interesting over time.
More like pop culture almost.
Exactly.
Like he's entered into the zeitgeist of pop culture and all the ways that we, I don't want to use the word appropriate in a negative sense, but the way that we take his image and his aphorisms and ideas and almost enters pop culture and almost like, it could almost like memify Maimonides, so to speak.
Yes,
and we're seeing that happen.
Yes. So the portraits that we have on the wall here are all from mid-20th century artists. We have Arthur Schick. This is Ben Shahn in the middle, and then Jack Levine. Each, if you really were to study it, think in terms of representing one particular aspect, or you can get a feeling of who Maimonides was, at least to the artist. It all goes back to the earliest physical representation that we have, somebody depicting Maimonides, and that's from this book printed in Venice in 1744.
And this is the first kind of depiction, picture that we have.
Certainly in print.
In print.
And it's the first that we know of. And there are also manuscript depictions, but this one where Maimonides is in a robe and he's got a beard and the
gold
turban,
medal.
Looks regal, this is the first. And then
does he say what he based this image on?
He based it on some medallion that he supposedly had that was ancient, which presumably meant that it was supposed to be what he really looked like. But of course, that's...
You sound a little skeptical.
Well, what can you do with something like that?
But it's so beautiful that you have the image over here, and then you constructed the way that image has, evolved and been appropriated in different ways over time.
Until today. So we have, for instance, a mug that actually has the very same image produced on here. We have the iPhone case. We have a mug that...
With sunglasses,
yes,
might I add.
Maimonides with philosophers, including Machiavelli and Francis Bacon and Judith Butler.
Tell me about this tank top over here. What's happening
this
here?
Tank top includes a page of an illuminated manuscript that we have in one of the other rooms. This is a manuscript that was produced in Lisbon in 1470 and 1471. There are 2 volumes. And when you look at the original here at the exhibition, the manuscript is from the British Library, it's astonishingly beautiful. Somebody found it so beautiful that they reproduced it on a tank top, although it's not in color, so you can't quite see it. But if you come to the exhibition, you'll see how fantastic it is. We have stamps, medals, currency, a mortar and pestle.
I need to call out over there just because I grew up, my father is a hematologist oncologist. He's retired now, but he practiced in Maimonides. I think he literally had, I remember seeing that.
Maimonides Medical Center in Brooklyn. So, which is why it's important to look at this one here. This is a t-shirt of Maimonides Park where the Brooklyn Cyclones play in Coney Island. And of course, it's not named after our Moses Maimonides, but it's sponsored by the Maimonides Medical Center. But anybody who's ever heard of Maimonides Medical Center without knowing the person now understands exactly where we're coming from. There are also graphic novels. And
the classic Machberes, that's a classic.
Here, a onesie and a What Would Maimonides Do sticker and the magnet. And this is also something that's quite interesting where this was an amulet produced in Jerusalem around 1960. This gets to the issue of who is Maimonides, and in today we can just read Maimonides into anything. Maimonides is the classic philosopher.
He did not like amulets.
There is no such thing as it's a worthless material that in fact is going to, it won't accomplish anything. And here you have him situated and juxtaposed with
Reb Shimon Bar Yochai
in this Kabbalistic setting.
So he can be appropriated, that's the prism of the Rambam, that you can see refracts in so many different directions, some of which are quite far from the original person, the room that we began in, even maybe farther than that, early modern period. But when you get over many, many centuries, have one person to have influenced Jewish thought, philosophy, legal thought, medicine, and you come all the way down and you still see his image on cell phone cases, on comic books, and even on things that Maimonides himself clearly wrote in his own pen, please don't associate me with this.
Right.
It shows you the transcendence of this personality.
And as Gabe Goldstein, who's the director of the YU Museum, likes to say, it is my Maimonides. Yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much to Dr. David Sclar for giving so much of his incredible time. Thank you so much to the Yeshiva University Museum for housing and really just bringing this incredible collection together, and for all the people who made this happen. Our incredible videographer, Uri Westrich, you're holding and you're not on, but we know you and we love you. And thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey through Jewish history. The golden
path,
Maimonides
Across 8 Centuries.
Maimonides Across 8 Centuries.